Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar for today. My name is Michael Lubis. I'll be your host, and this is Elixir and Phoenix Security Checklist 11 Best Practices. So a bit about my background. My name is Michael Lubis. I'm the founder of Praxeal.io, which was started in 2022. It's the first security company to ever have true Elixir support. Other companies have tried it and not done very well. Praxeal is definitely the first security company to really get into the market successfully. Companies using Praxeal, current customers include Podium, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, employer of Elixir developers, Change.org, Starfish, Lolo, Raven, brands I'm sure you've heard of. And then, for example, Oban Pro and Oban Web, recently I did a security pen test for them. So my professional background before starting the company, I've been a penetration tester, security engineer, consulting CISO. Within the Elixir community, I have contributed to Soblo, which is the open source Elixir stack analysis tool. I'm on the EEF, the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation Security Working Group. I created the open source project Potion Shop, which I use for security education and training at ElixirConf. I've also spoken at ElixirConf. And the reason for this background is because today the title of the talk is, 11 security best practices. There's a lot of these top 10 whatever lists floating around online. And I think it's important to scrutinize the background of the person writing it because it's a very reasonable question. Did they just type a prompt into an LLM and then publish it for content marketing, or do they understand what they're talking about? So I've actually done that before, and you'll get a response such as, use HTTPS. That's a common one. That's not on the list today because most people here are using HTTPS. It's sort of so common. And also, it won't lead to a security breach. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So this talk is based on my professional experience, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing it with you all today. So the topic is don't get hacked. Presumably, if you're watching this or listening now, you have an Elixir Phoenix application. It would be bad if that was hacked. The application is on the public internet, so it's going to be attacked constantly. The internet's a malicious place, and the goal for today is to learn how to defend yourself. So what happens when you don't defend yourself? Here are two high-profile breaches. In 2017, Equifax, which is a credit ratings agency here in the United States, it was breached while using Apache Struts, which is a Java web framework. So you have like Java to Apache Struts. Similar deal with Ruby and Rails or Elixir and Phoenix. So a vulnerability was in Struts, and then exploit was public on GitHub. That led to the company being hacked because they couldn't patch all of their instances of Struts in time, and it led to this really, really bad incident where the bad guys hacked into the server, got access, sort of the equivalent of production SSH access, pivoted through the network. The whole company got breached, and it cost $425 million. Not good. Also, everyone's social security number in the United States, it's a piece of private information. All of those were exposed. So that's why this was such a big deal. More recently, there was a breach with 23andMe, which was not the type of vulnerability where you could hack into the web server. Rather, it seems they did a credential stuffing attack, which means most people reused their email and password across sites. The bad guys probably used a bot to just do a lot of login attempts and compromise people's accounts. And then from that access, scraped a bunch of data through some feature they had. And while it wasn't the same type of vulnerability as Equifax, it was sort of a different method. The outcome was the same. There was a data breach. And literally a few days ago, actually, 23andMe said they're declaring bankruptcy. So I don't want to imply that the breach directly led to the bankruptcy, but it certainly didn't help their situation. So if you're interested in security and you decide to research this topic for yourself, you'll probably come across the OWASP Top 10, which is the standard document that every security professional knows about. If you're a developer interested in security, everyone's going to tell you to read this. It's referenced in, SOC, ISO, HIPAA. If your company is subject to compliance security regulations, they probably reference the OWASP Top 10. So here's an example. For 2021, the first item is broken access control, which makes sense. Yeah, that's something you want to watch out for. If you have a medical billing portal and I can read somebody else's test results, that's broken access control. That's bad. The thing is, the OWASP Top 10, it's sort of this index of all of these other different types of vulnerabilities, such as path traversal or storage of file with sensitive data under web root or open redirect or authorization bypass through user-controlled SQL primary key. And it can be a bit confusing, I think, for developers where, let's say you're an Elixir developer and you don't want to be vulnerable to the number one thing. And it says, user-controlled SQL primary key. You think, oh, well, that's related to Ecto. Am I vulnerable to that? What do I do? And the answer to that question is just use Ecto with the default query syntax. You actually don't really have to worry about this very much if you're using Ecto correctly. So what I've done for today is compiled a list of the 11 best practices where if you're an Elixir developer and you just don't want to get hacked, here's what you should do to prevent those OWASP top 10 style vulnerabilities that lead to a big data breach. So the talk is actually based on an article that I published, which was very well received by the community. So I'm going to be going through it more in depth here. Please feel free to ask questions if you have any during the talk in the chat. You can't unmute yourself, but please feel free to, I'll be checking chat throughout the webinar today. Happy to answer questions. I want this to be interactive, and I think people watching the recording later as well will also most likely have the same question as you. So don't be shy about putting your questions in chat, please. Okay, so these are ranked in order of importance too. So number one, if I came into a company and I was advising them on security, the first thing I would say is, do you have an inventory of all your public facing applications? How many Elixir apps do you have deployed right now? Of those, let's say they have 10, how many are on the public internet? What versions of Ecto, Plug, Phoenix are you running? When was the last time you scanned them for security problems? These are the day one, very basic questions I would ask. And the reason for this is because there often will be a vulnerability that everyone seems to be freaking out on over. And it's usually for a good reason, surprisingly. For example, when I worked at Frame.io, that's an Elixir startup, actually a unicorn. It was acquired for over $1 billion by Adobe. So when people ask, oh, what tech companies are using Elixir? You can say Adobe. You might have heard of them. They're using Elixir in production. So I joined the Adobe organization briefly after the acquisition, and the Adobe security leadership sent out this very high priority memo saying you need to figure out what services you're responsible for. Are they running Java because of this log4shell vulnerability? Because if you were using log4j and it wasn't patched, anyone could just hack into the web server and cause a data breach. And the leadership correctly realized that was a really, really big deal. The good news for me at the time was that Frame.io was just using Elixir. So there was no Java, and I was fine while the rest of the company was running around trying to deal with this situation. But it underlies the importance that if you don't have an inventory of all of these different pieces of software and their versions, and then a security incident happens, you can be in a really bad spot. Just this week, Next.js has this really bad vulnerability right now where you can bypass authorization if you're on a specific version, and people are running around coming out with proof of concept to determine if you're vulnerable or not. And there's some debate between, I think, Vercel and Cloudflare and everyone. But it just shows that you want to do this work now and not the day that the vulnerability becomes public. So this is something that Praxiel can help with if you're using the platform. So you can see there's sites on the left here with the environment, so dev, staging, production. And this is because, let's say you have a development environment deployed, but it's still facing the public internet, even if it's not handling PII, which is the personally identifiable information, people's health records or just their personal information. Um, Even if it's not handling those records, but it's exposed to the public internet and has critical or high vulnerabilities, somebody can probably hack into that and then use that server to then compromise the rest of your network. So really any server you have on the public internet needs to be inventoried, scanned for security problems, and managed in an intelligent way. And that brings us to number two, is to run security scans with Soblo regularly in CI/CD if possible. So Soblo is the security-focused static analysis tool for Elixir. The input to the program is your source code, and then it analyzes it, and then the output is, are you vulnerable to remote code execution via command injection? That's the kind of vulnerability that got Equifax that huge, huge problem. SQL injection, cross-site scripting, etc. And ideally, you want to run this in CI/CD so that, let's say you're introducing a vulnerability in a new pull request, that can stop it from making it into production. So something you'll hear people complain about with static analysis tools in general is the high false positive rate, where it'll say, oh, you're using binary to term or something, but it I'm not passing user input to it, so it's technically not a vulnerability, which is correct. But I think what is nice about Soblo is that it really discourages you from even using that dangerous function in the first place. So for example, if you scan a project with Soblo and you get zero SQL injection findings, you're good. That is great news. You might get a SQL injection finding that says you're constructing a raw query with string interpolation, and then you're passing it to like the ecto adapter, but maybe user input doesn't reach the function, which is good. So you're not technically vulnerable, but you shouldn't be constructing raw SQL queries if you can avoid it. That's why I like Soblo. I think it encourages really good security coding practices in your project. It can be difficult to use. This is an article I wrote called Real World Soblo. So the easy part is running the scan. The really difficult part is triaging all of the findings and figuring out if they're true or false positives, or rewriting your code so you avoid using the dangerous functions. So that's why I think it's better to start using it now and not a year from now. It's sort of the same thing with exercise. Like, it's going to be difficult if you start weightlifting or start running or swimming. But if you have to do it, the best time to do it is right now and not a year later when your doctor says you need to do it or you're going to have some horrific problem. Doing it consistently from the start is the best decision. So here's an example finding that Soblo will give. It'll have the confidence. The file, so like Potion controller on line 29 is using binary to term. And your reaction to this might be, what the heck does this mean? Because this is not even in the OWASP top 10. There's nothing about unsafe binary to term in there. So this is actually a good point to make. People often ask me, why do you contribute to Soblo if you have Praxiel? Aren't those kind of competing products? And the reason is I like giving back to open source. I like doing open source. But also, the companies that use Soblo for open source, they're sort of different. People buy Praxiel for very different reasons. I'll give an example here, where this is the Praxiel GitHub app. So here's the original, this is the information that Soblo will give you. And then this is the Praxiel guidance, which says, hey, this is critical. So this is the worst possible severity finding. This is Equifax tier bad. How do you verify if you're actually vulnerable to it? And then to fix it, it's just a one line. You just change this to non-executable binary to term. I like to mention this one because it looks, oh, like you're passing Erlang binary term with user input, but you have safe here. So it must be safe. The problem is the safe option only restricts the creation of new atoms. It doesn't prevent you from creating a new function at runtime. So that seems really unusual because if you can create the new function at runtime, you can just hack into the web server, which is way worse. And sometimes people will say, oh, if you want to learn security, like read the documentation for Erlang, which nobody's really going to do. But even if you do, this is what the Erlang docs say to do, and it's actually not very safe. So this is another reason, why people use Praxiel sort of for the security guidance and education here. Cool. Okay, I'll pause here for a moment. I wanted to read chat very briefly. Let's take a look. Someone's asking about SBOM. Yeah, actually, that's a good point, which brings us to this next item. But essentially, SBOM means an inventory of all of the dependencies that your project is using. SBOMs got really popular recently, but they're not quite the whole story with security. And I'll explain that here. But essentially, let's say you get a SBOM from your Elixir project. Okay. But you also need to determine if the dependencies that you're using are vulnerable. So, for example, the Equifax bug again, remote code execution, that can happen in the code layer, sort of the code that you're writing. That's what Soblo checks for, but it can also be through a dependency. So, for example, if plug were vulnerable to remote code execution, that would be a huge, huge deal. Everyone using Elixir in production would have to patch that as soon as possible. And running this check for, are we using a vulnerable dependency in CI/CD is what you want to be doing. So did we just do a code change that resulted in us using a dependency that's vulnerable? Good idea. So in the post for this webinar, I sort of teased this a bit where I say don't use GitHub's Dependabot, which I think is very famous. And it seems to work with Elixir. So here's an example project where I'm using Dependabot. You can see it wants me to bump all of these dependencies, including Paginator here. And this version of Paginator is vulnerable to remote code execution. There was that really bad problem in Paginator before, I think it was, 0.6.0 was definitely vulnerable to it. But if you go into the security settings in GitHub, it will not show you an alert for it because Elixir is not supported in some GitHub thing. And this is the story of every single security vendor that is not Praxiel when it comes to Elixir support. They might have it a little bit, but then it's missing in some really critical area. And you think, wow, like that's almost worse than nothing because you get this false sense of security because you're like, oh, like Dependabot works with Elixir. That's great. No, it doesn't. So what I recommend, open source solution, just use Mixaudit. It's really, really great. Praxiel also does this, but even if you don't, you're not in a situation where you could buy Praxiel, Mixaudit will alert you to this problem. And that's why I recommend it. SBOM is more about the formatting of the data. There's like Cyclone DX and all these other ones. It's more of a standard. But the whole point of SBOM is really to know what dependencies you have and then be able to respond to security incidents. So this is, if you need SBOM because you're working with the government or something, that makes sense, or a compliance reason. But for just preventing the security problem, not getting hacked, this is what you want to be doing. Okay, number 4, checking the ports and SSH settings on your web server. So this is sort of a generic one, but I think it's really relevant for anyone that hosts their web app, including Elixir devs. So bots constantly scan the internet for servers with exposed ports, weak SSH credentials, Docker exposed. If you're using a platform as a service like Heroku or GigElixir or FlyIO, you actually don't have to worry about this. This is a nice security benefit of the platform as a service model. If you are hosting yourself on EC2 instance or with GCP, this is something you need to be aware of. So ideally, you don't want to expose port 22 for SSH to the public internet. You don't want to leave password authentication turned on for SSH. You want to use public keys. And when you're restricting this access, You can do it at the Linux layer. I know there's UFW or whatever, but the much better decision is to do the AWS security groups or GCP firewall or Hetzner has firewall. Just the reason it's better to do this at the AWS level or at the cloud provider level is because let's say you're pushing something with a deployment tool and a setting gets changed on the web server and the port accidentally gets opened somehow. That's okay because you have the redundancy of blocking at the network layer, which is much stronger. So I'm a big like do it at that layer proponent. Um, so you can just go into your console for your cloud provider and check this. I actually recommend scanning your server yourself. Um, Open source tools that are free to do this include Nmap, which is sort of the everyone in InfoSec security knows Nmap. Nabu, I believe, is the more recent one. Might be written in Go. If you're curious about this topic of exposing ports, there was this incident. So Kamal is the new deployment tool from 37 Signals and the Rails people. So I know this is an Elixir webinar, but I figure there's some overlap here, and you can actually use Kamal to deploy Elixir. But essentially, it's a tool that goes to a server, SSHs in, installs Docker, and gets it all set up. It's a deployment tool, and somebody was using it and used Claude, I believe, to configure the Docker builder, and the server got hacked, and it was mining cryptocurrency, and it was because he exposed the Docker management interface to the public internet. So any web server that you have on a cloud hosted provider that you're paying for, you want to restrict those ports. You can whitelist it so only your IP can connect. That's a good idea. Much more secure. You want to avoid. You can read this whole article, and this is on the Praxeal.io blog. You can search for this. This is also a new Praxeal feature called network scanning. So you can see for this instance, 80 and 443, that's good. 22, which is OpenSSH with the password login, that I don't like that because you can set a weak password. I know some people will say, oh, technically it's fine, but doing public key only is definitely the most secure way just to avoid that from even happening. And you can see there's also a database port for MySQL exposed here. So that brings me to the next item. Don't expose your database server to the public internet. And the reason I want to sort of harp on this, it seems like I might be doubling up on items here, is you can run a web server with Elixir and Phoenix and Postgres all in the same box, and then have 5432 exposed to the public internet. But let's say you left the username and password to be Postgres. Somebody can just log into your database and steal all the data, and that's probably not what you want to happen. The correct way to do this, or what you should be doing, is don't have your database server on the public internet. Make sure that it's in a private VPC or a private network. And then if you need to access it, for database management, what you want to do is use SSH tunneling through the web server. There's no reason to expose the database to the public internet because even if you have a secure username and password on it, let's say there's a vulnerability in Postgres that comes out, then anybody in the world can just scan your server and try to log in. That's bad. Even if there's a remote code execution in Postgres, meaning somebody could find your web server that's running Postgres and then hack into it, if it's on a private VPC, you're just not affected by that. It just massively reduces the risk of an incident. Cool. Number 6 is going to be check for server-side request forgery. So this vulnerability is not as well known, so I'm going to go into detail about what is this. So consider the following scenario. You are building a chat application that's aimed at developers, and you want to code in a feature where if you paste a GitHub URL into chat and then send it to your friend, it'll populate with the stars and a brief description and that card that shows up on social media. If you want to code that yourself, how would you do it? To do that, you need to use HTTP requests. You have to take the user input, build the URL to GitHub, and then send the HTTP request to get that data from the server. Makes sense. So there was recently a vulnerability in Hackney, which is used on a lot of Elixir HTTP clients, including HTTP Poison. And the problem, let me walk through what is the bug. So here's the user input now. So instead of like the Elixir Lang repo, the user input is now symbols paraxial.io / and then the URL is the same. And here is our constructed URL that looks sort of odd. And then if you do an http poison.get, you can see that the request will not go to GitHub. It will actually go to paraxial.io, automated security for developers. And if you're using Mixaudit, you might have gotten a notification about this. So why is this a big deal? You can trick the HTTP client to send requests to a different URL. What's the big deal? So Capital One in 2019 suffered a data breach. It was over 190, it was about $190 million settlement. And it was this exact vulnerability called server-side request forgery. So what happened is instead of putting paraxial here, imagine if you put it's an internal IP address in AWS and GCP. It's 169.254, 169.254. Essentially, it's a management interface, which is private. But if you send an HTTP request to that endpoint, it'll return your AWS private keys. And most web apps today are deployed in environments where they can send requests internally to a Redis server, to a Postgres server, to other boxes that will return private data. So that's why this is a problem. When you hear about server-side request forgery, it's in the OWASP top 10, and it's something to watch out for if you're taking user input and then doing outbound HTTP requests with it. There's actually an HTTP client called SafeURL for Elixir that is meant to defend against this. You can also configure your AWS server to not have that endpoint exposed. There's quite a few mitigations you can do. I just want to highlight the risk of that vulnerability here. Number 7, be wary of using ImageMagick GhostStrip or FFmpeg on user uploads. So this is a pretty common situation. Let's say you're coding an application where users upload files such as images or PDFs or videos, and then you have to do some transformation. You want to resize the image or re-encode the video to be served online. Very common. There was a big vulnerability in, well, there's been vulnerabilities in all of these pieces of software, but there was a big one in ImageMagick called Image Tragic was the branding, and Basecamp was actually vulnerable to it. So that's the Rails company. They have very, very smart programmers, and they had this problem because everyone had this problem. Big tech companies, ImageMagick is running everywhere. So the point I'm going to make here is, I could talk all day about the technical details of this, but the summary is, if you're using these types of libraries to do image processing on files that have been uploaded, you have to be very aware of security vulnerabilities. Ideally, you want to sandbox it so it's not being processed on the same server with access to production sensitive data. There's other things you can do too. You can make sure that it's up to date, sandboxed. You can also just not process the uploaded files. So if you just put them in S3 and then serve them back to a user, that's actually more secure than doing this type of processing. I would say if you're in a business environment where this is really critical, get a penetration test and tell your pen tester that you're doing this, because they will say, oh yeah, that's really bad. I'll be sure to emphasize that during the test. That's really what I would recommend. You want someone with professional experience to look at this, and they'll be aware of the risk if they are competent at their job. Okay, number 8, rate limiting on authentication and payment endpoints. So what I want to stress here is that if you have an authentication endpoint where it's like email and password for login, or you have a payment endpoint, that's a very attractive target for attackers. For example, for the authentication endpoint, you're eventually going to get requests coming in, hundreds of thousands of login attempts per hour, where they're looking for users that reuse their email and password across accounts. There's this very famous service, Have I Been Pwned, where you can type in your email and see what data breaches your email and credentials will show up in. So most users will reuse their credentials. The point that I just really want to make is you need to have a system in place that's able to detect and alert on this and tell you it's happening. Um, the motivations are very common, if you're a financial application or a healthcare application, people are always just interested in stealing that data. Even if your application, it doesn't seem like it would be attacked. Maybe you have a small business that ships candy overseas or something, and you think, well, I'm too small, I wouldn't be targeted for this. It's a bit counterintuitive and unfortunate, but you're more likely to be targeted because all of the big companies, Shopify and Amazon, they have protection for this in place. So the reason you'll see this attack is because bad guys have hundreds of thousands of stolen credit cards and they need to test which ones work. So they'll create thousands of fake accounts. They'll do thousands of small payments, and you'll see a huge spike in business, and it's all fake. And you're going to have to ban all the accounts, and you might get banned from Stripe or your payment processor, and it's a huge headache to deal with. So this is a feature of Paraxial is bot defense. It's sort of the tools I've developed. I've actually had to deal with this professionally at jobs before, where people were trying to steal financial, straight up money, actually. They're just trying to break into people's accounts and steal their funds. So it's a big problem, and there's a lot of things you can do to prevent it. I don't want to spend all this call talking about bot defense. That's a whole area of Paraxial, but essentially it's something you need to be aware of. For open source solutions, rate limiting is really popular. I like Plug Attack. I know you can do CAPTCHAs, but nobody really likes those. They tend to be bad and harm the user experience. Not what I would recommend necessarily. Okay. Number 9 is scan your code base for secrets. So you might be thinking, yeah, there's a hard-coded credential in our database, but the database is, or sorry, in the code base, but the code base is private. What's the big deal? The problem is, even if GitHub is private and nobody else has access to it, you might have new people joining the team, and now other people can see the credentials, or there might be a vulnerability in GitHub itself where somebody could join your organization and then all of those credentials are exposed, or the repo is accidentally made public. Like, source code leaks happen all the time. But I think that there's also scenarios where even if you're perfect about that, let's say you go to deploy your application and then whoops, the Docker Hub, you accidentally built a public image instead of a private image, and now all your secrets are exposed. There's just so much that can go wrong, and that's why there's this best practice to have the secrets at runtime through a secure manager, through the environment variables. Don't hard code them. There was this very interesting article that I love where it says, how long does it take if you put a secret on the internet for somebody to try it? If you upload it to NPM or the Python package manager or GitHub or Docker Hub, people are out there looking for these secrets, API keys, AWS credentials, really any sort of credential, Stripe keys, and they're trying to, steal your access. This also came up in this article that I referenced earlier, the Rails 8 on Linux with Kamal, where by default, if you're just signing up for the first time, your Docker Hub will be public. So let's say you have an application and you want to try out this Kamal thing. Oops, it's public on Docker Hub by default. If you had secrets in there, those are all compromised now. So kind of a counterintuitive way where you really need to be aware of this problem. For detecting secrets in source code or in your Git history, I like Git Leaks. It's written in Go. It's a great program for doing this. Okay, number 10, checking for sequential IDs and access control violations. So this is something Soblo can't really check for. Essentially, let's say you have an endpoint that's like user metadata, the email, and it's 9323. whenever I get this on pen tests, I just immediately will just increment this to 4 and see if the access control works. And sometimes I can read other people's emails. And you can see how this would be a problem. Let's say test result, 5, 7, 12, increment that. You get the test result of someone that you're not supposed to see. That's a problem. So this style, the technical term is insecure direct object reference. You really don't want to be accepting user input for access control like this if you can avoid it. Ideally, this would be like a UUID, so you can't increment or guess it, or you can just have a test results page where you're just pulling from the user credential. So there's not even an opportunity to edit that value. I've seen this all over the place in applications, actually at university, when I was working as a security tester when I was in school, to today. I still see this. So watch out for this. If you're taking external input and then using that for access control decisions, it's a very common error that just shows up everywhere. Next one is similar to this. Check for mass assignment in Ecto. So I don't know how many people here used GitHub, back in the day. This was the sort of early days of Rails as well. GitHub itself is a Ruby on Rails application. And there's this famous incident where an issue is opened, 1,000 years in the future. And this led to some changes in Rails, where when you have a bunch of fields, I mean, this is Elixir code, but in Rails, if you have a bunch of fields for an object schema, by default, you used to be able to just update any of them from external user input. And now you have to explicitly define which ones can be set from user input, which Ecto also does. So I'm going to pause here. And someone in chat said, I remember this. Oh, yeah, it was a huge deal way back. So I'll pause here and let everyone read this, and you can find the vulnerability. I think everyone on this call will be able to see the vulnerability here very quickly. So you probably noticed that in the cast, this is a good design decision by the Ecto team. You have to explicitly say which parameters can be set from user input, and is admin would be a really bad one. You don't want that to ever be set by a user. You want that to come from a credential value or some kind of private information. So watch out for this as well. This is something that Soblo can't check for. I'm actually working on a project to detect this. I actually think the new AI models, this is a good use case for them, detecting access control violations in this manner, where is admin is a good example, should not be exposed to the public. Okay, great. So here's the whole list. This is a link to the blog post. We can do QA now. I'm actually going to leave the recording up so that people can watch the QA. But thank you all for watching. That's the conclusion of the talk. And I'm going to go to chat now and read the questions to everyone. Okay. One of the questions is, can you recommend Elixir secure coding training resources? Training platforms like Secure Code Warrior don't support it. Yeah, that's not surprising. I see this all over the security industry. Nobody supports Elixir. So Praxial actually offers a training. You can hire Praxial to come into your company and do the training. I've actually done it a few times for organizations that were concerned about code security, or they had a compliance requirement and they just didn't want to waste time on a training that didn't have Elixir. So you can reach out on the Praxial website. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I usually give it maybe once or twice a year for Elixir Conf. I don't know if I'm actually doing it this year. I'll check. Maybe if there's enough interest, if enough people ping me about it. But if you're a business and you need it for your employees, that's a lot easier to work out compared to the training, because I have to go to the conference for that, and I have to check my schedules. Checking for mass assignment. I have found it in a few production Elixir code bases. Yeah, that's not surprising. It's just one of those permission issues where I think it's because you're in the back end, like you're writing back end Elixir code, but it's sort of a front end check. So you have to get yourself in that mindset. So I wanted to call it out. I'm using Phoenix to ban for rate limiting. Do you have any opinions on that? I'm not very familiar with Phoenix ban. I've never used it myself. I would assume it's open source. I mean, I'm sure it's okay. But yeah, I've just never used it. Will your slides be available for download? I don't know if I have a good way to do that. I mean, this talk's going to be on the YouTube, on the Praxiel YouTube channel, so you can download the talk there. But maybe if you ping me on LinkedIn or something, I could send you the slides. I'd be okay with that. Phoenix upcoming 1.8.0 introduces a scope data structure using mixed PHX gen auth. Have you had a chance to take a look at it? And if so, do you have any opinions on it? No, I haven't looked at the scope data structure yet. Actually, Jose Valim attended a Erlang Ecosystem Foundation security working group meeting to talk about the mixed PHX gen auth. He is actually very famous in Rails too for writing Device. So I trust Jose's judgment completely. I think that Phoenix Gen Auth is fantastic. Him and Chris did a great job with it. So whatever they do, I sort of have this gut feeling where it's like, oh, okay, if this library was written by Jose, I'm probably not going to find any problems in it. That's the experience I've actually had on a lot of tests. Do you have any recommendations for projects using LiveView? I would say you do have to watch out for the access control problem. So I've seen it where people will remove a button, for example, as an access control mechanism. So, for example, you could imagine a button that says ban this user, and then, oh, if a user is an admin, display the button. Otherwise, don't display the button. And that's bad because somebody could still connect to the socket channel and send the message. I've actually think I've done that on tests before. So being aware of the access control between the front end and back end, watch out for that. And then I've gotten a lot of requests for bot defense with the Phoenix channels. People want a rate limit on channel messages. That's actually in Praxiel now. It's not in the free tier. You do have to pay for that. But if you're interested, you can sign up on Praxiel.io, create a free account. You get a 2-week free trial. You'll get upgraded, or you can ping me for that. So if you're a business or you are in a position where you can pay for security software, Praxiel can help you there. If not, I think you could still do it with the rate limiting libraries such as Hammer if you just needed something, open source. I believe that would work too. Do you have any recommendations for multi-tenant applications where subdomains correspond to schemas in the database? I don't believe that would cause any kind of unique security problems. Multi-tenant where subdomains correspond to schemas in the database. Yeah, I don't think that would cause much of an issue. Because with multi-tenancy, I've gotten requests about this before, but it's not going to introduce any big security issue. Like the big ones are remote code execution, code injection, SQL injection, server-side request forgery. Going multi-tenant doesn't really affect that. The items here are really touch on the things that are most likely to lead to a security incident. Is there any good DAST for, okay, so DAST is dynamic application security testing. So this question is there a good dynamic kind of like web scanner for Phoenix and LiveView apps? With most of the application being driven by WebSockets, would something like Zap still work? In my opinion, not really. The issue with all of the DAS providers at the moment is they have to pick a target to test on, and it's not going to be a Phoenix application. It just won't because I know Zap is a free project. There's other paid solutions as well, but when they test these things, they're going to use a Java or a Python or a Node.js. They're going after the largest market. The DAST products on the market today will not have test cases for Elixir. And I mean, I could do a whole talk just on the economics and the dynamics of why the security industry is that way. But the summary is if you're a security company, you probably took venture capital money and your target market is sort of the Fortune 500 or a big enterprise using Java. That's who you want as a customer. And then people always ask me, well, aren't you afraid of the big name, these big security companies coming in and stealing Praxial's customers? I always go no, because those organizations just are not set up to do that at all. And I remember, oh man, it was 3 or 4 years ago we were interviewing. It wasn't DAS, but we needed to buy security when I was working at Frame.io, and nobody had Elixir support. It was always on the roadmap, and it's been on the roadmap for 5 or 7 years at most of the big firms. So that's just the way the market is. Great questions, though. Thank you all. Cool. I don't see any more in chat. So thank you all for coming or watching on YouTube. I appreciate it. My name is Michael Lubis. Feel free to reach out. You can sign up for a free trial of Praxial.io for 2 weeks. Really appreciate it. Have a good one.